the quintessential South American rock star, whose mark on popular culture became indelible through his chords, lyrics, music, and style. A native of Buenos Aires who, since he was a child, painted, drew, sang, played instruments, did sports, and expressed his creativity in whatever way he could think of. But it would be his musical talents, along with those of two other companions, Carlos Fisichia, known as Charlie Alberti on drums, and Hector Z. Bocio on bass, that would propel him to the musical Olympus with the now legendary band Soda Stereo. We're talking about Gustavo Cerati, a man who would travel across the American continent with his rock and roll. From the stage, he made everyone jump everywhere. At the monumental de River Plate, at the Simón Bolívar Metropolitan Park in Bogotá, at the Home Depot Center in Los Angeles, at the Foro Sol in Mexico, in Viña del Mar, or wherever he stood out. He said goodbye for the last time performing Lago en el Cielo at the soccer stadium of Simón Bolívar University in Caracas, Venezuela. This is the life of Gustavo Cerati. This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking. And for those who have asked how to support La Nueva Enciclopedia, I have news for you. We have created a Patreon with exclusive documentaries on the most controversial topics, with live seminars taught by us, and with several more benefits. Your support is essential to keep this project going. Join us. You can find the link below. And in case you don't have an international card for Patreon, we have several payment options for you, and you will still be included in the community. We'll be waiting for you there. And without further ado, let's start today's video. Thank you. Gustavo Adrian Cerati. Clark was born on August 11, 1959, in Villa Ortuzar, Buenos Aires, in a lower middle-class household. A music lover with a mother of Celtic-Irish descent and a father of Lombard-Italian lineage, he loved listening to the radio since he was a child and participated in musical activities at school. He liked poetry, painting, drawing, as well as outdoor activities like athletics and swimming, where he managed to win more than one medal. But his true strength would be music. His first musical memory would be at the age of 9, when his parents gave him a guitar they brought from the United States. Influenced by the music scene of his time with sounds from Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Deep Purple, Frank Zappa, and the psychedelic rock of Led Zeppelin, they would shape the future musical prodigy. As a teenager, he managed to lead the choir at San Roque Institute, from which he would later be suspended for disruption. At the age of 13, he formed a trio and began playing at small parties in his neighborhood, for his friends, and at the local school. In 1979, he had to go serve mandatory military service. Those were the years of the national reorganization process in Argentina. After finishing his military service, young Gustavo enrolled at the University of Salvador, where he began studying social communication. But his passion was still music, obviously to pay for his guitar strings, amplifier cables, and sheet music from his favorite bands. He managed to support himself. He worked as a medical representative in the university hallways. He meets another student who is also passionate about music, Hector Bocio, also known as Zeta, with whom he joins to form a band. Influenced by the music of bands like The Police, The Beatles, and Elvis Costello, they begin to develop their own sound, and they look to recruit several names who would later also make an impact on the music scene, such as Daniel Malero, Richard Coleman, and Andres Calamaro. With the latter, they even formed a group called Erecto, which lasted very little and eventually broke up. It was the time of the Falklands War, when the military junta had banned the broadcast of bands like Pink Floyd, Rod Stewart, and David Bowie. Despite this ban, their records were still played in clubs and homes clandestinely. In 1982, in the middle of summer, Gustavo Cerati, 22 years old, and Zeta Bocio, 23, were in Punta del Este, Uruguay, trying to see how their band sounded. Meanwhile, Gustavo's sister, Maria Laura Cerati, was constantly harassed by a man named Carlos Fisichia, a situation in which Cerati decided to help her. One day, the phone at the house rings and Gustavo answers. It was Carlos Fisichia asking for Maria Laura, in a conversation that started with Cerati asking him, "What are you doing? Which sister are you talking about?" The two ended up having a conversation about musical tastes, in which Carlos Fisichia told him that he was a drummer and that he was the son of the famous jazz drummer and composer Tito Alberti. So interested in his talent, Boccio and Cerati decided to hold an audition with Carlos on the condition that he cut his hair. The band would record a demo that included the song "Why Can't I Be" from the Jet Set, a song that would later become a hit single on their debut album. They experimented with several names until they settled on Soda Stereo, partly because of the amount of soda Cerati drank during the band's rehearsals. The band's first gig as Soda Stereo was at the birthday party of a friend named Alfredo Luis. Later, he would become the band's video director, visual stylist, and aesthetic arranger. Gustavo himself would recognize him as the fourth member of Soda Stereo. The band's commercial debut was at the Airport nightclub in the Belgrano neighborhood of Buenos Aires. No one applauded them because they played with some very old and affectionate amplifiers. However, despite the boos, they were happy to have achieved their first formal gig. On August 17, 1983, after gaining experience in the underground club and disco circuit of Buenos Aires, the band's first album was released. In December 1983, Argentina concluded the national reorganization process with the election of Raúl Alfonsín. In that atmosphere of openness, Soda recorded their first music video called Dietetico. In 1984, Soda debuted with an album with the same name as the band, called Soda Stereo. You can't talk about Cerati without mentioning the women in his life, and the first girl who marked his artistic life was a young woman he met at a nightclub. Her name was Anastasia Chomicin, a 15-year-old girl. Meanwhile, Cerati was over 20. They called her Tashi, and she would eventually become Cerati's muse. To compose songs like In the City of Fury and Games of Seduction. Obsessed with achieving their own ideal sound, Gustavo, Seth, and Charlie locked themselves in the garage listening nonstop to The Police, Depeche Mode, and The Cure. The result of that seclusion would be the songs from Nada Personal. The second album is Soda Stereo, which would take the band to #1 in Argentine rock. Its darker sound helped Cerati evolve as a songwriter, moving him away from the naive and fresh tone of the debut album. By the summer of 1985 and 1986, Soda Stereo was the breakout band of the scene. Gustavo had already left college, and the relationship between Gustavo and Tashi had finally materialized. But the age difference and the lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll took a toll on their relationship. As the band rose to stardom in the middle of a tour, Cerati left Tashi, and he got involved with an attractive model named Noel Balfour, who went from being just another groupie to the new muse of the Argentine. However, this relationship faded in a short time. This happened in a context where Soda was rising to Argentine stardom with the album Nada Personal. Those were days of direction and of white towns, frequenting the Buenos Aires nightlife scene. But the expansion begins, and Gustavo goes with Soda Stereo to invade Chile, under the rule of Pinochet, who listened frenetically to Argentine rock. On that tour, Gustavo, Seth, and Charlie noticed that Nada Personal had a sound a bit closer to what they were looking for, with dark and emotional lyrics. As a curious note, Gustavo composed the famous Persiana Americana. After participating in a radio show where listeners competed by sending in lyrics and the musician composed the melody, Cerati liked one of the proposals so much that he got in touch with the listener who had sent it, and then improved it in Cerati's own words. "I wrote all the lyrics in one go. We were living life to the fullest. It seemed like we were far from art, and yet it was one of our deepest albums. Maybe because we weren't having a good time at all." The third album, called Signos, almost cost the singer his life because the band was using a lot of stimulants, locked up, paranoid, and working in a house in a very bad state with terrible heating. One day, Gustavo woke up with a deep pain in his chest and his heart was pounding. Tachycardic, his heart racing and pounding, Panic made him fear for his life, and he rushed into the first hospital he could find. After this hospitalization, he decided to reconsider his consumption habits. Sinos is an album that marks the most important evolutionary leap in Cerati's career as a songwriter. There's a dynamic mix much more sophisticated than the previous ones. Soda Stereo was facing the curse of the third album, where they either changed their style or stayed forever in the Argentine rock scene. Faced with this challenge, the band's manager decided to have Soda embark on their first long-range continental tour. Then they took a vacation in Europe and became familiar with the cultural scene of the old continent. Cerati was very protective as a songwriter, at a time when the band was growing. Between the albums Nada Personal and Signos, copyright royalties earned a lot of money. While Zeta and Charlie said that Soda composed as a band, Gustavo insisted jealously that he was the one who wrote the songs. This rift becomes evident in Signos. Only one song is credited to all three of them. People close to Cerati said that the singer would tell Zeta and Charlie that if they wanted to split the rights equally, they should bring their own songs or lyrics to the studio. The album Signos, marked by the cracks in Cerati and his bandmates' lives. It was followed by the album Doble Vida in 1988, a transitional record that pushed Gustavo and Soda into a new stage. They were already established as stars. Meanwhile, Cerati marries Belen Edwards for the first time, but it ends in failure shortly after. Arguments with Zeta Bosio and Charlie Alberti were frequent. They decide to break their contract with their manager and go on vacation to reorganize. Doble Vida includes tracks like Picnic en el Cuarto B, Lo que Sangra, and the iconic song En la Ciudad de la Furia, a song whose riff Gustavo composed when he was 14 years old, and he ended up materializing it in a song about which he asked for the opinion of the young Tashi, even while he was married to his wife Belen, with the young Tashi being his eternal muse. But before releasing the album Doble Vida, Cerati met Cecilia Amenabar, whom he would marry in 1992 and then be together with for 10 years. From that marriage, Cecilia and Gustavo would have 2 children, Lisa and Benito. Thus comes the 5th album, Canción Animal, in 1990, an album that completely marked Soda Stereo, considered one of the best albums in the history of Spanish-language rock. The album Canción Animal contains tracks like De Música Ligera, an eternal anthem of Spanish rock that continues to play everywhere, evoking excitement, as well as En el Séptimo Día, and the song also called Canción Animal. The album, released on August 7, marked a turning point in the band's career. For them, it had been a recording like any other. But when the album hit the record stores and the songs played on the radio, they began to understand the magnitude of what they had achieved. In those new songs, Gustavo had made a definitive leap as a songwriter, putting himself almost on the same level as Charly Garcia and Luis Alberto Spinetta. They reinvented themselves with a rawer, more rock-oriented album, focused on Gustavo's guitar sound. Latin rock had just given birth to its first classic album, a classic album, one that others would follow, a monumental national tour throughout almost all of Argentina, playing 14 times in a row at the legendary Gran Rex, thus smashing Charly Garcia's record. And after that local tour, there would be an international tour that took them to Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Venezuela, and the United States. After a tour that leaves them exhausted, Gustavo, Seth, and Charlie take a 2-year hiatus and then return to the studio to record Dynamo in 1992. Dynamo was a more mature album because Gustavo and his bandmates were no longer the young guys from 1983, but men well into their adulthood. And this is evident in songs like Remolinos, Primavera Caro, Luna Roja, and Claro Oscuro. After the Dynamo album, Gustavo's love life, as he left one relationship to enter another, led him to the arms of Cecilia Amenabar, as well as to Santiago de Chile. That decision would be one of the stigmas that would later lead to the separation from his band. They get married, travel, have their first child, and are happy in an apartment in Santiago. From time to time, Abosio would visit him and everything was going well. He learned to ski and spent his life with his wife and son without a schedule, writing, drawing, enjoying fatherhood in a unique family symbiosis. Disconnected from the world during this hiatus, he decided to record his first solo album in his apartment called Amor Amarillo, and he got the inspiration to name it after some little stones, which he called amarillos, that he collected in Los Roques, Venezuela, together with his wife. That album broke the image his fans had of him, since he made it in parallel with Soda and in an intimate tone. It wasn't a big-selling album, but it was the realization of a personal project for him. He returns to Buenos Aires with his children, and they settle in a comfortable apartment. Musically, by 1994, even though not everything was going well, as for Soda Stereo, the Argentine rock scene hadn't changed much since Soda Stereo stopped playing. No one took their place, and President Carlos Menem's economic situation was negative for the local industry, which stopped being competitive against the avalanche of imported products that flooded the market. Added to measures that left thousands of people out of the job market forever, the big deficit of those years was going to be a minimum of 20% unemployment in Argentina. That double dimension of consumption and exclusion was soon reflected in Pronto Llega el Séptimo y Último Disco by Gustavo Cerati from Soda Stereo, after a 3-year break that gave him and the other two the chance to gain some perspective on their own work. They created an album with a polished, solid, and contemporary crystallization for that time of what Soda Stereo was. With that album, Cerati decides to return to Santiago with his wife and son. Cecilia Amenabar becomes pregnant again, and that return to Santiago meant another disconnection from the band. The tour went through Panama, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and the United States with a break to record an music television unplugged special, which shows us Soda Stereo's hobby of experimenting with different sounds, even though they weren't being questioned as a band. There, the performance of En la Ciudad de la Furia stands out, with Andrea Echeverri from Aterciopelados. Without really expecting it, on May 1, 1997, Z Boccio and Charlie Alberti were surprised to read a letter that Gustavo had written to the newspaper Clarín, where he announced his separation from Soda Stereo. Despite how abrupt the situation was, Charlie Alberti persuaded Gustavo to do one last tour through Latin America to say goodbye to their fans, and in such a way that everyone who worked with Soda Stereo would receive severance pay. Gustavo agreed, and they played in Mexico, Venezuela, Chile, and everything ended on September 20-1997 at the monumental stadium of River Plate. That night, more than 50,000 people filled the stadium for Soda Stereo's debut and farewell at River. The group had burst onto the scene as an almost ska band, then became pop, dark, and almost funk, until finally becoming the great rock band of Latin America. They started out as 3 guys just starting out in life, who parted their hair with soap, and 15 years later they were already 3 mature men. Z had gone bald, Charlie had gray hair, and Gustavo used hairpieces to add volume to his hair. On the stage at River, they were breaking up, sounding better than ever. The show was a summit of classicism, electricity, and emotion, ending with the Musica Ligera, the most iconic hit in the band's history. Not only would we have been nothing without you, but also without all the people who have been around us since the beginning. Some are still with us today. Thank you, said Gustavo into the microphone, and he paused for a split second trying to finish that sentence, while the air was still vibrating with the last chords, and 60,000 people absorbed those thousands of volts of energy turned into stadium rock. It was a split second that swallowed up the band's 15 years of history, and in his head, suddenly, he saw everything like the end of a great movie. So, he was freed from naming anyone before the final explosion of the song, and just added, "Thank you, total." But this story didn't end here. After closing the chapter with Soda Stereo, Gustavo, Cecilia, and their 2 children settled in a spacious house in Buenos Aires. He remodeled it and installed a recording studio. He began working on his own projects, which included collaborating with his idols from the Police on a tribute album. Together with Desorden Público, Plastilina Mosh, and Los Pericos, he ended up covering Bring on the Night, translated into Spanish as Tráeme la noche, 1998, in a year when Charly Garcia was holed up in his decaying house. Luis Alberto Spinetta was busy cooking up his rock and jazz albums and was hiding from the press deep in his heart. Andrés Calamaro was lost in dreamlike delusions caused by drugs, and Gustavo Cerati was in dad mode, raising his children and being a good husband to his wife. With the same artistic concerns, he finds inspiration among synthesizers to compose and record the album. Bocanada, in an era of electronic pop when the Chemical Brothers and Fatboy Slim were going mainstream, when the press or his fans criticized him for his electronic tastes. And with that shift from rock to synthesizer, Gustavo Cerati simply got annoyed. Bocanada opens with Puente, a catchy radio-friendly rock song that became a hit and played everywhere. Gustavo was back and he was alone. However, during the Bocanada tour, people were more eager to hear him play Soda songs than his own tracks from the album. But this situation wouldn't last long. Despite the album's success, Gustavo's personal life was falling apart. The flirtations with Deborah Del Corral, who was Charlie Alberti's ex, reported in the press, ended up causing Cecilia Menabar to divorce him, leading Gustavo to withdraw into himself. In music, you can also find references to episodes of Big Brother in Disney movies, like Finding Nemo. And from those periods of isolation comes, in 2002, Siempre es Hoy, a scattered and energetic album that displays his sorrows and pains, which critics and the public did not receive very well. Even so, he went on tour and continued his rock star life with Deborah Del Corral. He was running out of energy, and the girl decided to go her own way. Without her, Gustavo was heartbroken and decided to seek comfort with his family at his mother's house. Cerati would lick his wounds, composing with his old friend Tweety Gonzalez. He experiments with sounds inspired by Led Zeppelin, takes ayahuasca, and gets into brainwaves with his friends, 40-somethings going through the turbulence of a midlife crisis with rock and roll. He doesn't give up his role as a father, and during his many outings with his son Benito, he finds the inspiration to compose Adios on a CD where his son had written, "To be able to say goodbye is to grow." During the recording sessions, Gustavo maintained a superhuman level of concentration. Besides being an excellent musician, he was also a very demanding and perfectionist producer. During the filming of the music video for the song Crimen, Gustavo suffered a breakdown caused by thrombophlebitis in his leg. All those years of smoking were starting to take their toll on him, and he couldn't believe it. He had never felt his real age. He felt like a young spirit floating in a body that always responded to him. But suddenly, there he was, admitted to an intensive care bed, with doctors telling him that his lifestyle was not healthy at all, and that clot could have killed him. He followed his treatment, but despite doctors' warnings that his excesses couldn't continue, he soon relapsed, resumed drinking, and continued as before. He went on his tour and got ready for another creative cycle. He goes on tour in Europe, played live a couple of times with Shakira, and then goes with her and her musicians through the Mediterranean of his life. Cerati spent his time watching movies and series. He was a fan of the series Lost, and in those moments, happy life would come and go. His former manager from his Soda Stereo days, as well as an occasional phone call from Zeta Bosio, kept him in touch with what was happening in each other's lives. And one fine day, Gustavo, Zeta, and Charlie decide to play together again, with the sound that had brought them to fame a quarter of a century ago. They played 22 shows, 14 throughout South America, 7 in North America, and 1 in Central America. For fans and critics, it was the best sound of Soda Stereo. Fuerza Natural is Gustavo Cerati's last album, another musical metamorphosis with a new sound, clean, acoustic, with psychedelic pop and folk. He embarks on a tour that Cerati carries out with great dedication through Mexico, Argentina, Peru, Chile, the United States, Colombia, and which tragically ends in Venezuela. During the first half of the tour, he was on and off with his last girlfriend, Chloe Bello, who had to leave him to fulfill some commitments in Europe. Gustavo looked exhausted. He arrived late to sound checks, and after every show he would go out partying until dawn. After 2 concerts in Medellin and the Medellin Ciudad concerts, he looked exhausted. He would arrive at sound checks and stay until dawn. With his right hand on his heart, he went down to his dressing room behind the stage, drank some water, lit a cigarette, and wrote to his girlfriend. His collaborators congratulate him, and he tells them it was the most successful show of the tour. The Simón Bolívar University campus was packed and the band sounded perfect. When the sound engineer Adrian Taberna asks him what he wanted to do after such an epic finale, Gustavo tells him he wanted to sleep. Very strange, because that Australian rocker never slept, not after a concert. He changes his white suit for a shirt, puts on a jacket and pants, and leaves the dressing room for a group photo with the organizers. What he didn't know was that his blood was getting thicker. Somewhere in his body, a clot broke loose from a wall of his circulatory system. It all lasted 2-3 seconds. Gustavo stood behind the sound engineer Taberna, not understanding what was happening to him. The camera took the picture without a flash, and the photographer asked them to stay still while he reset it. Taberna turned around to make a joke to Gustavo, but saw him pale, his face contorted. Gustavo looked at him as if to say something, but his jaw couldn't find the words. A part of his neural tissue was no longer receiving blood and was starting to shut down. This time the camera flash worked and everyone applauded. Taberna sees him walking confusedly toward his dressing room and asks his assistant, Nicolas Bernardo, to go with him to see what's happening. When they entered, Gustavo had unbuttoned his shirt and was lying on the couch. Bernardo looked for the paramedics, and after clearing the dressing rooms, an ambulance took him to La Trinidad Clinic. When they arrived, the clinic had no power, so they went to another medical center for his exam. At dawn, they returned again to La Trinidad Clinic, and he was admitted for observation. Gustavo spent Sunday in the clinic conscious, but unable to speak or move the right side of his body. Taberna and Travis were with him all day, helping him stand up, walk to the bathroom, or sit on the couch to watch television. Gustavo seemed confused and annoyed, but at least he was more active than the night before. There was no diagnosis, but he seemed to be recovering. At night, while he slept, the area of his brain that had been damaged by lack of blood flow slowly started filling with water. On Monday morning, when the nurses entered the room, they found him with his eyes tightly shut, holding his head with the hand that still responded, and feeling unbearable pain. They immediately took him to the operating room and called his family. It was already clear that it was a stroke. As the news spread, his sister Laura flew from Buenos Aires to Caracas. In the operating room, the surgeons opened a part of Gustavo's skull to relieve the pressure caused by the swollen hemisphere. He was transported in an air ambulance on June 7, 2010. He was admitted to a specialized clinic with the best care, but nothing more could be done for him. He had lost 70% of the function of his brainstem, the brain pathway that connects all the sensory routes, and he had lost his left hemisphere. He spent 4 years in a coma and passed away on September 4, 2014, at 9 in the morning in Buenos Aires. His death was mourned throughout Argentina. President Cristina Fernandez declared 2 days of national mourning with the flag at half-mast. His funeral procession was accompanied by his fans, who covered the vehicle carrying the coffin with flowers and Cerati. That's how he came to rest alongside his father in the La Chacarita cemetery. Cerati left a legacy that marked a before and after in Spanish rock. He turned the genre into a big business and left a musical trail that still influences the great performers of the genre to this day. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that you give us great support by leaving your comments, giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.